Well, the Trump administration is escalating its war on Ivy League institutions in particular. Let's put D1 up on the screen. Harvard is now under fire because the Trump administration, as everyone likely remembers, just from the last couple of days, has sent a letter threatening at least $2 million worth of funding. Billion, yes. So $2 billion worth of funding. That could go up to as much as $9 billion worth of, again, federal funding to Harvard. Then what you see on the screen, if you're watching this, is MIT put out a letter. This is from Sally Kornbluth, the president, who said, "I write to bring you up to date on developments in two areas where recent government actions are interfering with the normal functioning of MIT, diminishing our ability both to serve the nation and to attract the world's finest talent." One relates to federal funding, the other to our international community. They say we are responding to certain federal actions by going to court. Now, this is all on the heels of what the Trump administration did with Columbia University. And there are competing reports on Columbia University's willingness to actually comply with this list of demands that the Trump administration has sent and said, we'll get into that in a moment, by the way, but what those demands are in particular, but has said your federal funding depends on X, Y, and Z being done. Columbia, there was a leak that said Columbia was assuring people privately that it wasn't actually going to comply with the administration's demands. Now it looks like Columbia is standing by its statement that it will comply with the demands to keep the federal funding. But Harvard is pushing back hard, like we haven't seen other universities do, but it seems like it's actually creating a template for other universities to follow. And Krystal, let's just get into this back and forth that Caroline Leavitt had with Peter Doocy. It wasn't really much of a back and forth, but this is what we heard from the White House yesterday.
Follow up on something that you just said. Why do Ivy League schools get so much federal funding?
It's a very good question, and it's a question the president has obviously raised in his discussions and negotiations with not just Harvard, but also Columbia and many other Ivy League institutions. We have the anti-Semitism task force, which the president promised and delivered on. The anti-Semitism task forces across the government, representatives from various federal agencies who meet on a weekly basis to discuss the question that you just raised. And I think a lot of Americans are wondering why their tax dollars are going to these universities when they are not only indoctrinating our nation's students, but also allowing such egregious illegal behavior to occur.
And here's a post from Donald Trump on Truth Social. Yesterday, he weighed in once again. Perhaps Harvard should lose its tax-exempt status and be taxed as a political entity if it keeps pushing political, ideological, and terrorist-inspired / supporting, quote, sickness. Remember, tax-exempt status is totally contingent on acting in the public interest. Krystal, that is separate from the federal funding question. It's a similar question, but it's obviously a different question. Federal funding, what is being said, and maybe it's worth actually just bringing up D6 at this point. Sorry to skip ahead, control room, but this is an argument that has been made for generations in the conservative movement, that if you are getting federal funding, it is tied to complying with civil rights legislation, and this has actually been something that conservatives have pushed back on forever. And it was Rufo who really popularized the idea a few years ago now, that if Republicans regain power in the White House and the DOJ, et cetera, in the Department of Education, they should use that power to turn the screws on these Ivy League administrations that have benefited from this sort of relationship with the federal government, back and forth relationship with the federal government, to punish those universities for not being as open to conservative ideas as people on the right want to be. And it is true. I mean, like, Harvard is wildly, like, the faculty of Harvard is, it's not a balanced faculty at all. Like, I think we all know that these institutions lean left. So the plan was then to use the civil rights regime. Like, Title IX is a good example. Conservatives used to be against Title IX because it forced compliance with the federal government in the schools in ways that would sometimes, disproportionately hurt men's sports. We don't need to debate whether or not that was righteous and just, but conservatives used to be against it because it was using federal funding as a carrot in particular ways. So that brings us to D4. What is the Trump administration threatening Harvard over? Well, some of it is civil rights, but Michael Tracy points out that one of the bullet points, among the many bullet points in the Trump administration's letter to Harvard that kicked all of this off, is titled Reforming Programs with Egregious Records of Anti-Semitism or Other Bias. Krystal, I'm going to kick it to you on that point.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't want to hear from Christopher Rufo or any of these people again about supposed like wokeness. This is the most woke authoritarian shit you could possibly imagine, including effectively what they want from Harvard is some sort of like MAGA affirmative action program, both in terms of the students coming domestically and abroad, and in terms of the professors. They also, I mean, there's just all kinds of ridiculous demands here. And the demand that you get rid of DEI does not sit easily with the demand that you also, do everything to combat anti-Semitism. Like the whole thing is just, the specifics of it are almost less important than the fact that this is about the Trump administration, just as they have with media, just as they have with lawyers, just as they have with the courts, trying to bring to heel institutions that they see as ideological adversaries and potential alternative power centers. It is also a very classic authoritarian playbook, right? They want to be able to ultimately control what is taught, who teaches it, and what students get into the school. Now, to zoom out, because the Columbia thing is, I think, important. Harvard was seemingly planning to kind of comply. They got an initial list of demands from the Trump administration, things like banning masks, that they were like, yeah, we can probably live with that. Then they got a more elaborate list from the Trump administration, the one that Michael Tracy is referencing there. And they saw that when Columbia tried to comply with what the Trump administration wanted, it's not like the Trump people are like, okay, you're good to go. Thank you. We've art of the dealed it. We're good to, all no harm, no foul. No. Columbia's capitulation only led to more and more demands. Now the federal government is seeking a consent decree with Columbia that would give them direct power over, over that university, and specifically have taken over the Middle Eastern Studies Department. Harvard is extremely wealthy. I think it's one of, if not the wealthiest school in the country in terms of it has like a $50 billion endowment. Yeah. If anyone was going to stand up and fight, it was Harvard. And so I think watching the way that things went down with Columbia, they realized that there was no choice but to stand up for themselves. And the fact that MIT then rapidly follows in their footsteps, I think is an indication that you will see more of a united front from the university system in trying to stand up to what are, ultimately like insane and like peak woke kind of authoritarian demands coming from the Trump administration. So, I think those are kind of the dynamics that are playing out here, is that they realized they were not going to make them go away by attempting to comply with the things that they ultimately wanted. And, last thing on this question of like, oh, well, why do they even give federal funding, right? A lot of this is like research grants. Harvard does a lot of medical research. They run a bunch of hospitals. A lot of the larger $9 billion that would be threatened, that's like funding that goes to a number of these hospitals. I know there were some researchers who already were, I think one that was researching tuberculosis, if memory serves correctly, like their grants are already being pulled. So that's the sort of thing that a lot of this money is ultimately going towards, in case people were wondering. It won't be easy for Harvard to make up the multi-billion-dollar gap, because their endowment comes with certain restrictions about how the money can be spent, et cetera, et cetera. But I think they feel like they have the firepower to be able to fight this, and that frankly, they really don't have much of a choice.
Well, I mean, some schools take the funding and put in lazy rivers, which is genuinely a serious problem. They take the research funding, and then they have these big endowments, and they keep, using tuition, jacking tuition up for stupid stuff that gets them up on the U.S. News and World Report list and attracts more students, or doesn't attract more students. But I think the Trump administration's definition of anti-Semitism is obviously woke, and it is obviously undermining what, listen, as a conservative, I think is a very righteous cause, which is to scare the living daylights out of these universities that have done, I think, a very poor job preparing people people to enter our society after 4 years of education at supposedly the best institutions in the world. Rufo is right. Like, he's run down these examples of where Harvard in particular has engaged in actual discrimination by the definition in our civil rights legislation and in our court system. And that is something that, again, was used repeatedly during the Title IX battles of roughly the last 10 years. The Obama administration, we don't have to get into all of this, but this has been going on for generations, used federal funding as a way to get sports to change their policies about men's and women's, schools to change their policies about men's and women's athletics and locker rooms and bathrooms and all of that, which I think brought conservatives to their sort of boiling point, and that's where you saw this new momentum come from to actually do these things. I think that's, Rufo has pointed out a lot of DEI coming from all of this, and DEI can be used in a way that is not in compliance with federal discrimination laws. So again, like schools like Hillsdale have had to operate without federal funding forever so that they didn't get the ideological coercion. I always think that that's the best model, even if it's sad that we can't fund public universities in a way that's ideological. I mean, maybe we can, but ideologically beneficial to everyone. But anyway, all of this is to say, the woke definition of anti-Semitism is like undermining, I think, a pretty legitimate conservative policy argument here, because you end up scooping people like Ozturk off the streets of suburban Boston and then claiming the moral high ground on free speech. Like, it's just completely stupid. On, by the way, a generational opportunity to flip the script on the left and actually like get some genuine concessions out of schools. I'm not talking about like quotas and affirmative action for conservatives, but just like scaring the living daylights out of them to like just using the money that they have in a way that is actually beneficial to the public. That's all great. I think that's fantastic. But this is completely, you do not have the moral high ground when you're scooping kids off the street for op-eds. I mean, it's just stupid.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, a lot of the, like, the lazy river and the fancy dorms and athletic facilities or whatever. I mean, we know what that's about. That's about attracting rich students. Mm-hmm. That's what it's about.
Yep.
It's a market capitalist
who can pay full tuition
kind of a situation where, who can not only pay full tuition, but are then going to be in a position, them and mommy and daddy, to help to continue to fund the endowment. The direction I would go in is, public funding for colleges and making tuition free, or at least much more accessible. But, certainly the cost of education is a big issue. This has nothing to do with the cost of education. And even on the DEI piece, like, this is specifically about these Ivy League universities, although there's some, I think the number is 60 universities across the country that have gotten similar letters. They're not all, Ivy League. I know the school I went to, University of Virginia, was one of the people who got these letters of like, threatening them. Basically, you have to do X and Y and Z in order to continue to receive your federal funds. So it's not just the elite, but they like picking the fight with the elites very publicly because they feel like they're on more solid ground there in terms of their kind of ideological framing. But, these broader executive orders about DEI, something that, I am in certain ways sympathetic to, because I do believe in like a colorblind meritocracy. Yeah. Well, I don't really believe in meritocracy, but I do believe in the colorblind aspiration. And I think that the sort of like extremes of wokeism with as emblematic, Ibram X. Kendi and these sorts of people went too far. But also these executive orders, it could be interpreted to ban the teaching of things like redlining, the history of redlining, the accurate history of Reconstruction, the accurate history of slavery and Jim Crow. And that is a tremendous step backwards. And it's also, this is part and parcel of a playbook of like, wanting to control history. History is always contested. Wanting to control the narrative that we're allowed to tell, the story we're allowed to tell about ourselves, and to erase how central the battles over race and racism have been in this country. And so, this is a little bit removed from the Harvard example, but I see all of these things as connected to an attempt to, they'll use language about, we want it to be neutral. No, you want a certain narrative to be taught. You want certain students to be allowed to attend. You want like MAGA affirmative action, both in terms of the students and the professors. You want to control these. This is not about academic freedom. This is the polar opposite of that. This is about this administration specifically wanting to control these institutions in terms of what they can teach, how they can teach it, and who they can teach it to. Even including, they wanted to, one of the demands from Harvard was that they should be vetting all international students for quote unquote anti-American sentiment. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? Are you allowed to be, have a critique of the Iraq War? Are you allowed to have a critique of Tesla? Are you allowed, certainly are you allowed to have a critique of our policy vis-a-vis the Middle East? Those are the sort of like authoritarian woke demands that were laid at the feet of Harvard. And, the last point I'll make about this, just zooming out from education, is I do think as Trump has become more unpopular and as there has been a visible grassroots movement in the streets to push back against him, et cetera, I do think it has bolstered the courage. You're starting to see a little bit more galvanized resistance from these, cultural institutions, whether it's Harvard. The media is being a little bit more outspoken. There's still a lot of problems there. Some of the law firms are now getting together and fighting back. You see certainly the courts are starting to take a harder line. Democrats are getting a bit of a spine. That's, we're about to talk more about the Democrats in the next block. So you do see some of these elite institutions getting their act together to push back a little bit. And I guess you could say that with regard to like some of the business institutions on the tariffs too.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, if people want to read a good book on this, Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell is a short read, and it was hugely influential. I mean, I've seen some people point to the book Richard Hanania wrote a couple of years back, but Caldwell is the book that really was influential on the right at kind of mapping out how civil rights legislation and then its process of moving through the courts over the course of decades allowed the federal government to use a lot of that for ideological purposes. And what you're describing, Krystal, is the Trump administration saying, all right, screw it. Like, we're not going back to neutrality, which is what a lot of, or quote unquote neutrality, there's no such thing as real neutrality, but sort of this pro-American, pro-Western civilization sense of consensus on in society that used to exist, whether or not that's good or bad. That was the aspiration of a lot of critics of this, actually on the left and on the right, mostly on the right for a long time. But this is the Trump administration saying, screw it. This is about our agenda items. And that's where I think this definition of anti-Semitism is dragging down what is a great project overall. And it is it's a huge unforced error. I don't know who in the administration is pushing this so forcefully without listening to any of the feedback on it. I actually I agree with what a lot of Christopher Caldwell outlines in Age of Entitlement. But man, I don't know how you can approach this issue as, it's like we were talking about earlier in the show, J.D. Vance going to Munich and then being the vice president and talking to the UK about speech policies or the EU about speech policies, and then being the vice president of an administration that is defending scooping kids off the street for op-eds against Israel. I mean, it's just, this is like a generational opportunity for people on the right. Maybe that'll amuse some people. But on the right, that is being just utterly squandered. And I do think, by the way, that the way that civil rights bureaucracy has been wielded by the left has been intentional in some cases, not in every case, but I do think, there were abuses of it that were for ideological purposes over the course of the last however many decades. That doesn't mean that the right thing to do is do it yourself. It's stupid, whatever.
Yeah, anti-Semitism is the cudgel that's being used to, embrace, it's truly authoritarian tactics. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. And I'm not just talking about with regard to universities, but certainly with the snatching up these kids off the street and, cracking down on speech and dissent, forcing universities to, either kick kids out of school who are American citizens. I mean, this isn't just about immigrants either, the actions that have been taken. And so they've adopted this, like, the most hyper woke language you could possibly imagine about, like, safe spaces and microaggressions.
Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. That is, I mean, we saw this argument made at a Senate hearing recently from a rabbi.
That's right.
Matt Walsh pointed out, actually, of all people, that this is exactly what Ibram X. Kendi has argued. You know, Natalie Winters, I was talking to her yesterday from Bannon's War Room. She makes a great point that, like, and you would still disagree with it, Krystal, but, like, anti-Americanism would have been politically a better framing for the administration than this definition of anti-Semitism that is also anti-Zionism. Now, where you and I might disagree with that is, okay, now that you have defined anti-Semitism as anti-Zionism, I'm going to need to see you outlining exactly what you think anti-Americanism is, because I'm not sure that I trust that definition at this point. So if they want to do anti-Americanism, which they are trying in, like, some different ways that aren't as, I think, front and center as the anti-Semitism point, then they should enumerate exactly what they're looking for when they're telling schools to screen for anti-Americanism. I would be very curious to see that because, you know, personally, I'm like, yeah, maybe you shouldn't bring people here who hate the United States, and there are people who hate the United States, but what are you going to do to screen for that? Is it going to be people who didn't like the Iraq War? Is it going to be people who don't like Israel and the way that it's treated Palestine? I mean, it's just like...
Or who aren't a fan of Elon Musk, who, you know, South African born.
Yeah.
You know? I personally would like to screen this administration for anti-American sentiment, given that they want to turn us into El Salvador and and apparently are not acquainted with the First Amendment and freedom of speech or, you know, whatever requirements for due process either. So
Dems can do that as soon as they get the power back. They can do it again, right? But that's that's part of this. I mean, if you want to write the template to be exploited in terms of deportation and all of that, I mean, here's the template for Dems.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.